Hey everybody, welcome to the shanty. Yes, it's Christmas time in the shanty. I know you want me to sing to you, don't you? It's been a while. We're getting toward the end of the year, and we've just had something come up that I think is of interest to all of you, and that kind of plays into some things that we're going to be doing next year. So I thought we'd talk about it for a minute. And what we're going to talk about is, briefly, child labor violations and the Fair Labor Standards Act. And we're going to clump them both together because they both come under the Department of Labor at the federal level. There's also obviously state level stuff, but they come under the Department of Labor. And the Department of Labor is focusing on this sort of thing right now, and we'll be focusing on it going into the end of the year. There was a news release back in, let me see if I can find a date. I can't find a date. I may have to edit this part out. Oh, it was on December 4th. There was a news release on December 4th from the Department of Labor, and the headline says the following. Department of Labor finds poultry processor illegally endangered children in dangerous jobs, robbed workers of wages, and retaliated by firing workers. The subheadline says Los Angeles area plants ordered to pay $3.8 million in back wages, damages, and penalties. Now, before you all shut this off and run away and say, well, I'm not a poultry producer and I don't endanger children and I pay all of my employees everything they're entitled to, stick with me for a minute. I know you do that, but there's some lessons to be learned here. There's some lessons to be learned here because, once again, if you take the news release from the Department of Labor at face value, and you have to be a little careful about doing that, but if you take it at face value, this case would seem to be an object lesson in how not to do this stuff. And when you get caught, if you get caught, or when you get investigated at least, how not to respond to the investigation. So where do we start? Well, let's start with this. The news release points out that this is one of a series of poultry producers who have been investigated and found to be wanting by the Department of Labor. So the news release says the following. This consent judgment, there was a consent judgment entered into in order to get all this stuff paid. You don't need to worry about that. It's a legal thing. This consent judgment is part of the department's ongoing effort to combat child labor abuses and wage theft in the poultry and meat processing industries. So if you do happen to be, if you're one of our agricultural clients and you do happen to be in the poultry or meat processing industry, now your ears should be perking up, because what this is telling us is that the DOL is specifically targeting those industries right now because they found abuses there. And once they find one, they think there might be 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 or 6. Now, if you're not in the poultry or meat processing industry, that doesn't get you off the hook, because if one of your competitors down the road in the auto industry, for example, happens to be violating these statutes, that will turn the DOL onto your industry, and pretty soon you might be subject to an audit and you might have the DOL knocking at your door. So let's be careful. Again, the consent judgment is part of the department's ongoing effort to combat child labor abuses and wage theft in the poultry and meat processing industries. The action follows the division's investigation of a different company, a sanitation services company that served those industries. They got assessed $1.5 million in child labor penalties in February. In that case, investigators discovered that the company had employed at least, are you ready for this? 102 children from the ages 13 to 17 years of age in dangerous occupations and had them working overnight shifts at 13 meat processing facilities in 8 states. In March, the department recovered $355,000 in back wages for 322 workers in Alabama and North Carolina who were denied overtime wages. And between 2020 and 2023, the department obtained judgments against 3 La Puente County poultry processing companies requiring them to pay more than $1.2 million for denying overtime wages to 113 workers and deliberately using intimidation to hide their wage theft. The investigators are currently probing the death of a 16-year-old worker at a Mississippi poultry plant. All right, so if you thought this stuff wasn't going on in the United States of America anymore, you are wrong. It is going on. But what does that get us to? Okay, so here's what the division found. And we're going to talk about this in broad strokes, not in specifics, but in broad strokes, so that you can understand how it might apply to you. First, they went in and they found significant child labor violations. That is, children, and the definition of children is anybody under 18 years of age. And as you may or may not know, the child labor laws at both the federal level and the state level put kids, depending on their age, into certain groups. And the older the kids get before they hit 18, the more they can do. But any child is not allowed to work in what's called a dangerous occupation. In this case, the investigation found that the company and the owner specifically employed children as young as, quote, 14 years old to debone poultry using sharp knives and operate power-driven lifts to move pallets. Okay, so that's rule number one from the broad spectrum of this thing. You cannot use children under 18 to engage in dangerous occupations. If you go look at the FLSA and the child labor rules, there are lists of what is a dangerous occupation. Almost all heavy manufacturing is a dangerous occupation, and kids under 18 years of age are not supposed to be working in it. That's not your office. That's heavy manufacturing. If you're in the auto industry, kids aren't in your plant, right? If you're in the stamping industry, kids aren't in your plant. There's certain power tools that kids can use and can't use. Like there's a difference between a vacuum and a grinder. But there is a long list of occupations that kids can't do, and that's the first thing we need to be reminded about the child labor rules. The second thing we need to be reminded about the child labor rules is children, unlike adults, are limited in the number of hours they can work in a work week. All right? So the second thing they found is the children also worked excessive hours in violation of federal child labor regulations. All right. Now, there's not only federal child labor regulations, there's state child labor regulations, and those labor regulations dictate when a child, depending on how old they are, can work. For example, I'm going to give you some example. I say for example, then I say I'm going to give you some examples from the Michigan rules, okay? Here we go. Let's start with this. Minors age 14 and 15, obviously I'm reading, I'm looking away. A minors age 14 and 15 years old, combined hours of school and work cannot exceed 48 hours in a work week. 14 and 15-year-olds may not work before 7 a.m. or after 9 p.m. You'll remember I told you that one company was working kids the night shift. You can't do that. Kids as young as 13. By the way, you aren't even supposed to be working. Minors 16 and 17-year-old may work 24 hours per week when school is in session and 48 hours per week when school is not in session. 16 and 17-year-olds may not work before 6 a.m. or after 10:30 p.m. Sunday through Thursday and 11:30 p.m. on Friday and Saturday when school is in session and 11:30 p.m. 7 days per week when school is not in session. So as you can see, there's limits in the hours of work that these kids can work. Now, the other thing you need to remember is children actually have to be given breaks. You've heard me say before that adults don't have to be given breaks, but there are rules under in Michigan and under the federal law, by the way. If you're listening to this in California or some other states, different rules. But children do have to be given breaks, and there's rules about when they have to be given and when they have to be paid for. So those are the child labor things that you need to be aware of. But the other thing from the investigation that was interesting was that there was a failure to pay overtime by paying either a piece rate or just a straight hourly rate for overtime. In other words, this company was paying employees when they worked more than 40 hours per week, but they weren't paying them overtime time and a half. Whether they're working a piece rate or whether they're working an hourly rate, a non-exempt employee has to be paid overtime when they work over 40 hours in a work week. We all know that rule, right? Except for one thing. There's an exemption for our friends in agriculture. But that exemption is very narrow, all right? So there's actually a fact sheet about this if you want to go see it, if you're in agriculture, and it's called fact sheet number 12, Agricultural Employers under the Fair Labor Standards Act. And we start with following. Virtually all employees engaged in agriculture are covered by the Act in that they produce goods for interstate commerce. All right. So there's two ways you can be covered by the Act. You can be covered as an industry, or an individual employee can be covered. And if they're rules that we're not going to get into. Almost everybody in the United States is covered by the Fair Labor Standards Act. There are, however, some exemptions which exempt certain employees from the minimum wage provisions and the overtime pay provisions, or both. Employees who are employed in agriculture, as that term is defined in the Act, are exempt from the overtime pay provisions. They do not have to be paid time and one-half their regular rate of pay for hours worked in excess of 40 in a week. Okay, now that gets us to what is the definition of agriculture. And that's not an easy thing, and certainly not one that we can deal with effectively in the time we have here. But the fact sheet goes on to say agriculture does not include work performed on a farm, which is not incidental to or in conjunction with such farmers' farming operations. It also does not include operations performed off a farm if performed by employees employed by someone other than the farmer whose agricultural products are being worked on. So, if you're in meat processing, you're working on poultry, that's an agricultural product. You would think that that agricultural exemption would apply. No, it does not. Because you're not actually raising the poultry. You're now processing the poultry. All right? That's all I'm going to say about that, but that's something you need to know. The third thing that this thing found that I want you to be specifically aware of is that these guys were cited for retaliating against their employees because the employees cooperated in a wage hour investigation, and they retaliated by cutting the employees' wages. Okay, now we all know that you can't do that. You can't retaliate against an employee who engages, participates in, complains about your FLSA processes to an investigator, or even to you or to your HR department. Retaliation is against the law, and it will get you in trouble faster than the underlying violation. As a matter of fact, you can be found to have not have made the underlying violation and still be found to have retaliated and be held liable. So I'm telling all of you this. Most of you aren't in agriculture. Some of you, the agricultural group is going to get this, but some of you are. The reason I'm telling you all of this is to tell you this. The FLSA, you think you know it. I know you think you know it. I think I know it. Guess what? We don't know it. It is incredibly complicated. And every once in a while, we have to go back and we have to look at it. And we have to ask ourselves, are we doing everything we're supposed to be doing under these statutes? Now, it's real easy to determine whether or not we're paying overtime and if we're properly paying overtime to the people that we're paying overtime to. And we certainly know whether we're employing children. At least I hope we do. But what about things like classifications? Do we have everybody classified exempt who's really exempt? Have we looked at the duties tests? A lot of you, I know, not you, because you guys are our clients and we do really good things to educate you. A lot of people out there think, well, if I just pay that guy's salary, I don't have to pay him in overtime. That's not true. There are actually rules for when people are exempt and not exempt, and you all know this. But we need to be reminded of this from time to time. So, what's the moral of this story? The moral of the story is this. You should be looking at these things. And every once in a while, you should give yourself a little reminder of what the rules are. We're going to help you do that. That's right. This was one big, long commercial. Starting next year, we're going to do a series of kind of 101s. We're going to start with the FLSA. At least the plan right now is to start with the FLSA, where we get into some of these basic rules that you need to know and understand. So whether you're a brand new HR person who needs to learn these things, or whether you've been doing HR for 30 years and you need a refresher, and trust me when I tell you you do, keep your eyes open for the mailers on this, because you're going to want to do this. The other thing you might want to think about is an audit. We can help you with that too. Anyway, be aware that this stuff is going on out there. We are not immune to it here in the United States as much as we like to think we are. We all follow the law. I know you all follow the law, but there are still people out here who don't, and apparently intentionally don't, and they end up getting $3.8 million assessed against them in back wages and penalties. And we don't want you to be there. If I don't talk to you between the end of the year now, have a happy holidays. Got the lights up in the shanty. If you need anything, you know how to reach us. Give us a call, and we'll talk to you all soon.